John Wayne sort of squints at it, looks at me. People were really careful around him, and they gave him space.
Ron Howard reveals the 6 evil actors of Hollywood's golden age. Everyone sees Ron Howard as Hollywood's steady compass, calm, respectful, and untouched by the industry's madness. But when he was asked about the dark side of the world that raised him, something in his expression changed. His voice lowered, his smile faded. He admitted that if people really knew what some of their golden era heroes became once the camera stopped rolling, they'd never look at them the same again. Because according to Howard, old Hollywood wasn't golden at all. It was a world built on silence, power, and intimidation. A place where fame acted like a shield, allowing certain stars to behave without consequences. Behind the fantasy America fell in love with were broken people, broken careers, and secrets carefully buried by the studios. And after decades of staying quiet, Ron Howard is finally willing to mention the names connected to that chaos. One of them, Errol Flynn, the charming rebel, the devil behind the smile. Long before smooth-talking spies and rum-drinking pirates took over movie screens, there was Flynn, the fearless adventurer who made danger look romantic. On screen, he was Hollywood's perfect hero, bold, sharp, and untouchable. Off-screen, Howard said he was something else entirely. Born in Tasmania in 1909, Flynn stormed into Hollywood during the 1930s and became an overnight sensation after Captain Blood in 1935. Studios built an empire around his charm, but behind the bright lights was a man spiraling through ego, recklessness, and addiction, a personal storm hidden behind a flawless grin. By the early 1940s, his golden boy image was already rotting from the inside, and in 1942, the cracks finally exploded. Errol Flynn, Hollywood's untouchable heartthrob, found himself standing trial over accusations involving 2 young women, Peggy Satterlee and Betty Hansen. The headlines were everywhere. The country was split in half. Some called him a monster. Others called him a victim of jealousy and fame. Inside the courtroom, Flynn didn't look afraid at all. He laughed, he smirked, he acted like the rules didn't apply to him because in his world, they almost didn't. Warner Brothers hired top lawyers. Fans slept outside the courthouse like it was a movie premiere. And behind the scenes, whispers started spreading, witnesses being pressured, stories changing, certain voices suddenly going silent. When Flynn was finally acquitted, Hollywood celebrated. But the shadow never left him. Years later, private letters from 1978 surfaced showing Flynn bragging about his behavior, mocking those who said they had feared him. For Ron Howard, learning about that trial became a turning point. It shattered the illusion. He realized Hollywood didn't just create stars, it protected them, even when they did terrible things. To the public, Flynn remained the charming rebel. To those who saw behind the curtain, he became a warning sign. His life unraveled in slow motion. Alcohol, drugs, money problems, and excess without limits. By 1959, his body was completely worn out. At just 50 years old, he collapsed in Vancouver after pushing himself past every possible boundary. The official cause of death listed heart failure, cirrhosis, and ulcers, but Howard believes the real cause was simpler. Flynn lived a life of extremes. He took more than he gave. He burned brighter than he could sustain. And in the end, his story became a symbol of Hollywood's darker truth, a reminder that charm can hide cruelty, and fame can't protect you forever. Behind the blinding smile of a Hollywood hero lived a man constantly at war with the world and himself. Kirk Douglas never stopped fighting. To Ron Howard, Douglas wasn't just a legend, he was a contradiction wrapped in charisma. On screen, he preached justice, loyalty, and courage. Off screen, his reputation told a different story. Sharp, intimidating, always on edge like a storm waiting to break. Born Izard Danielovich in 1916 to a poor immigrant family, Douglas didn't just rise from hardship, he attacked it. Every role, every audition, every door that closed became another battle to win. By the time Spartacus turned him into a global icon, he had achieved everything: power, wealth, respect. But those who worked beside him said the anger never left. Crew members described him as impossible to please, a perfectionist with a temper that could freeze a set. One wrong move, one wrong take, and the air changed. Actress Deborah Padette once claimed he didn't just want to lead a scene, he wanted to dominate everyone inside it. Ron Howard, who studied Douglas closely while learning his own craft, later reflected on what he saw beneath the surface. Behind that confident grin, he sensed something darker, a quiet rage, the kind that never rests, the kind that slowly consumes a person from the inside. And then came the stories Hollywood never wanted to talk about. Over the years, controversial accounts about Douglas's behavior toward women during the 1950s resurfaced. Some writers and industry figures pointed to claims linked to Natalie Wood, referencing comments made by her sister, Lana Wood, in a 2018 memoir. These accounts have been debated for decades, with no way to fully verify them today. Many central figures are gone. Ron Howard has stressed that these stories reflect the complicated, often secretive culture of old Hollywood, not courtroom-proven facts. A system where power, silence, and fear lived side by side behind the glamour. Because in that golden age of cinema, not everything that glittered was gold. He never faced charges, and the storm quietly vanished, swallowed by the same wall of silence that shielded powerful men for decades. Even after his death in 2020, at 103, the truth didn't resurface as cheap gossip. It came back through the voices of professionals who finally felt free to speak honestly about what old Hollywood was really like. Douglas had a presence that could lift a set or freeze it. One moment, people felt inspired. The next, they were walking on eggshells. Stanley Kubrick, who directed him twice, once called Douglas the most driven man he'd ever met and the hardest to control. But to Ron Howard, the real lesson of Douglas's life was never about talent or fame. It was about what happens when power goes unchecked. Douglas moved like the rules never applied to him, and Hollywood let it happen. So when he accepted his honorary Oscar in 1996, many saw an old man trying to end his life with grace. But Howard saw something else entirely. He saw the final performance of someone who had spent decades staying 2 steps ahead of his own demons. Behind all the applause was a truth the industry never wanted to face. Some of its biggest legends didn't just build their careers on talent, but on fear, control, and dominance. And while Errol Flynn symbolized corruption and Kirk Douglas embodied explosive rage, there was another kind of darkness, quieter, colder, but just as damaging. Faye Dunaway. To Ron Howard, she was proof that Hollywood's darkest side didn't only show itself through violence. Sometimes it appeared as ego, as humiliation, as the kind of cold, calculated control that could silently crush an entire set. She looked untouchable, like a statue carved from ice and spotlight. But behind Faye Dunaway's glamorous rise was a reputation that made entire film sets hold their breath. Born in 1941 in Bascom, Florida, Dunaway shot to fame almost overnight. Bonnie and Clyde in 1967, Chinatown in 1974, hit after hit. She wasn't just a star, she was cinematic royalty, with a cold, magnetic beauty that felt almost unreal. But off-camera, a very different story followed her. Whispers moved faster than headlines. Crew members spoke about explosive tantrums, impossible demands, and assistants treated as if they were disposable background props. Her Mommy Dearest co-star Retenya Alda once said, "You could feel the fear on set, like everyone was waiting for an explosion." Ironically, the film meant to expose emotional abuse became, in many eyes, a mirror of Dunaway herself. While playing Joan Crawford, a woman long described as cruel and controlling, Dunaway was accused of channeling that same energy off-screen. Director Frank Perry later admitted he nearly walked away from the project because of her outbursts. She reportedly threw objects, screamed at makeup artists, and once refused to shoot unless the lighting made her look perfect. Ron Howard would later cite her as an example of what happens when artistic control turns into emotional domination. and the stories kept piling up. On The Wicked Lady, she was said to have slapped the cameraman. On Don Juan DeMarco, crew claimed she humiliated assistants so badly that production shut down for a day. Her former manager Jay Bernstein put it bluntly, "Faye doesn't just play divas, she becomes them." By the 2000s, Hollywood had enough. The phone stopped ringing. Directors quietly passed her name over, calling her too difficult. In 2011, when she was removed from the Broadway production of Tea at 5, Dunaway blamed everyone but herself. And when a journalist later asked Ron Howard about her legacy, he chose his words carefully, but his message cut deep. She didn't fall from grace. She eroded, one tantrum and one icy glare at a time. She chased perfection so fiercely that she left compassion gasping behind her. By the time Hollywood finally turned its back, it wasn't sudden or shocking. It was the ending everyone had quietly predicted. The woman who once ruled red carpets found herself unwelcome at the very events created to honor her legacy. To Howard, she became a warning. This is what happens when brilliance loses its heart. As he once put it, people talk about power. In Hollywood, power without grace turns to poison.
And then there was John Wayne, the tyrant of the West. To America, he was the myth made flesh, the cowboy, the war hero, the man who never broke. But Ron Howard, who grew up idolizing him through a fuzzy black and white screen, eventually learned the truth that shattered the legend. "The moment I heard who he really was," Howard recalled, "I stopped seeing the hero. I saw the bully wearing a flag like a costume." Born Marion Morrison in Iowa in 1907, Wayne built his empire by selling a fantasy of unshakable toughness, a brand of masculinity millions swallowed whole. But behind the scenes, the man who symbolized American grit carried a darkness that no camera ever captured. By the 1950s, John Wayne wasn't just a movie star. He was a walking manifesto. On set, he wielded his fame like a weapon, turning disagreement into weakness and progress into betrayal. Crew members who failed to meet his exacting standards were humiliated in front of everyone. Actor Christopher Meacham recalled, "When Duke was angry, the air froze, and according to him, you either stood with Wayne or you were gone." Ron Howard later reflected that this wasn't filmmaking, it was fear masquerading as discipline. Wayne's tyranny didn't stop at yelling. Women were belittled, indigenous performers mocked, and black actors challenging stereotypes were dismissed outright. Even off-screen, Wayne's views sparked outrage. His 1971 Playboy interview revealed deep prejudices, harsh opinions on indigenous land rights, dismissive remarks about black Americans, and an insistence that films needed men, not whiners. These comments resurfaced years later, shattering the heroic image many held of him. On The Searchers, his clash with director John Ford illustrated the man behind the myth. Ford wanted Ethan Edwards portrayed with honest complexity, a hateful, vengeful figure, but Wayne resisted. The result? A character whose cruelty shone on screen, mirroring Wayne's own chilling rigidity. Ron Howard never forgot the first time he really understood how terrifying genius could be. "It's terrifying because you can't tell where the role ends and the man begins," he said, reflecting on the shadow of John Wayne, a man who, even weakened by cancer, never wavered in his beliefs. Wayne dismissed criticism, blamed the changing times, and clung to his worldview until his death in 1979 at age 72. The icon remained untouchable in the public eye, but for filmmakers like Howard, the story was a cautionary tale. Power shaped by prejudice doesn't mellow with age, it turns bitter. The myth survived, but the man behind it never deserved the legend, Howard said. But Hollywood had darker corners than Wayne's stubborn pride. For Howard, Roman Polanski was the embodiment of a truth the industry refused to face. "Brilliance can coexist with evil," he admitted, recalling the painful realization that talent doesn't absolve a person, it can hide them. Polanski's ascent seemed unstoppable. Born in Paris in 1933 to Polish parents, he survived the horrors of World War II long before Hollywood ever knew his name. Early masterpieces like Knife in the Water and Rosemary's Baby cemented him as a master of dread, turning suspense into art. Yet, as Howard later recognized, the darkness on Polanski's screen was no fiction. It mirrored the storms he carried behind the camera. Everything changed in 1977. Polanski was arrested after a photo session with a young teenager, facing overwhelming legal evidence that led him to plead guilty to unlawful conduct with a minor. A shocking revelation that forever altered the lens through which the world viewed the filmmaker's genius. Before the gavel could fall, Polanski vanished. He fled the United States, resurfacing in France, never once agreeing to face justice. The Hollywood world erupted. Some condemned him as irredeemable. Others clung to the idea of the tortured artist. The industry was split, and the rift it created still echoes today. For Ron Howard, a young filmmaker witnessing it all, the spectacle was devastating. They spoke of art while a child's life was shattered, Howard recalled years later, shaking his head at how the industry twisted itself into knots to avoid accountability. Polanski's self-imposed exile became one of Hollywood's darkest stains, a reminder of a system that shielded talent while ignoring those who were hurt. Across the Atlantic, Polanski never stopped working. In 2003, he won an Oscar for The Pianist. The moment was surreal and stomach-turning, Howard admitted. As the Dolby Theater audience rose in applause, Howard remained seated, frozen. "I thought of that girl alone at 13 and how that sound must have echoed in her ears," he said, incredulous that the industry could celebrate a man so loudly while the past remained unaddressed. Decades later, Howard's anger hadn't waned. When Polanski took home France's César Award in 2020, protesters walked out mid-ceremony. To Howard, it felt like delayed justice. It took the world 40 years to say what should have been said the next day, that a monster doesn't become less monstrous because he can frame a shot, he told Vanity Fair in 2021. Polanski still lives freely in Europe, protected by legal loopholes, but haunted by the controversy tied to his name. For Howard, his story is a microcosm of what poisoned Hollywood's so-called golden age, a system that forgave genius at the expense of humanity. "Hollywood forgives anything," Howard said bitterly, "even when it shouldn't. Hollywood loves a smile. It sells movies, magazines, and dreams, but sometimes that smile hides a storm. Mickey Rooney was that storm. While Polanski exposed Hollywood's hypocrisy, Rooney exposed its illusion, the idea that charm could erase the wreckage left behind. For Ron Howard, who grew up watching Rooney's cheerful musicals on late-night TV, discovering the man behind the grin felt like a punch to the gut. "He was the face of joy," Howard said once, "but behind that smile was misery, and worse, he spread it." Born Joseph Ewell Jr. in 1920, Rooney became Hollywood's first massive child superstar. By 18, he was the highest-paid actor in America, with MGM building an empire around his grin and boundless energy. But fame came at a cost. The brighter he shone, the darker his life grew. Rooney married 8 times, cheated frequently, gambled away fortunes, and left a trail of emotional wreckage. Ava Gardner once called him the shortest man with the biggest ego in the world. Behind closed doors, chaos thrived. In 2011, allegations emerged from his 8th wife, Jan Chamberlain, and her son, claiming they isolated him and seized control of his finances. Yet long before that, tales of Rooney's own harshness were legendary. Former co-workers described him as sharp-tongued and unpredictable. Judy Garland, his closest friend during the MGM years, said privately, "He could make you laugh one minute and tear you down the next." Rooney's life was a Hollywood musical in reverse. The song was bright, but the story behind it was heartbreak. Mickey Rooney could make the world laugh, but behind that grin was a storm no one saw coming. Judy Garland, haunted by her own struggles, later hinted that Rooney wasn't just a fellow actor, he carried some of the weight of her early pain, adding another layer to Hollywood's hidden cruelty. By the 1960s, Rooney's own life was unraveling. Scandals, addictions, and financial disasters seemed to chase him relentlessly. In a 1979 interview, he said, "I've lived 1,000 lives." But as Ron Howard would later observe, those lives were lived entirely for himself. Even in his later years, anger clung to him like a shadow, blaming studios, partners, friends, even fate for the collapse of his world. When Rooney passed away in 2014 at 93, he left less than $20,000.
His body initially went unclaimed until friends raised funds for a modest burial in Los Angeles. For Howard, Rooney's story wasn't just tragic, it was a final confirmation of a pattern he'd seen throughout Hollywood. The brightest smiles often concealed the darkest truths. He made the world laugh while he was dying inside, Howard said, calling it the saddest kind of evil. In Hollywood, pain sometimes becomes performance, and nobody notices until it's too late. The Golden Age wasn't golden at all. It was built on silence, pressure, and lives hidden behind fame. And as Howard put it, the scariest monsters aren't in horror films. They're the ones the spotlight protects.